Thank you, Donnie. Well, good evening. I'm Kendall Harmon, as you heard, and I'm supposed to speak on confronting evil and final arrangements. And I thought I would just tell you briefly that I essentially spent 3 years of my life writing and thinking about this. So you have no idea how much I want to say. but I'm not going to do that. But I've been told that I have about an hour, and I grew up in a family where you had to fend for yourself at the dinner table and ask questions and be asked questions all the time. So I'd probably take like 35 minutes, maybe 40 minutes, but I anticipate and hope that I'll generate questions. I'd much rather take questions than do all the talking, if that's okay with you. So what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about what I hope to say, and then I'm going to say it, and then I'm going to say what I've said, and then I'm going to take questions, if that's okay. I should warn you, just in case you probably don't know, I grew up in central New Jersey. My father grew up in New York City, and all his life he was accused by his students, my dad was a chemistry teacher, of speaking too quickly. And I taught the book of Revelation when I served at Holy Comforter Sumter back in the 1980s for 2 years. One of the women in my class came up the second year and said, you know, the problem with your class is I feel like I'm taking a sip from a fire hydrant. So I need to warn you in advance that when I say I'm going to talk for 35 or 40 minutes, you're going to feel like a ton of stuff is hitting you. But part of the value of this is to put a bunch of stuff on the plate that we can then try to digest together. So if you have questions, just take them down, and if anything's not clear, we'll try to get back to it. Does that sound like a plan? All right, what I want to do is try to say something about the problem of evil. I don't know what my two preceding speakers, Bishop Allison and I guess Ian, has been. You did the intro, so there's actually been 3. Okay, so Donnie did the intro, Bishop Allison, Ian. But I'd like to say something about the problem of evil in general. And then I want to say 3 ways that the problem of evil has sought to be resolved in the history of Christian theology. And then I want to do my part, which is the most important part, so I don't want to take too long in these introductory things. But I want to say something about the Christian tradition and the way that people have tried to work out the problem of evil in terms of its final resolve. So when I say final resolve, we're talking death, judgment, heaven and hell, the second coming of Jesus, and the fact that the God who made history is actually coming back to judge history and complete history. Right? So does that make sense? But I want to start by defining the problem, even though I'm sure that that's already been done, because it's very important in the most difficult areas to define it precisely. All right, you ready? Ready to take a sip from a fire hydrant? Here we go. Okay, so we're going to start at the beginning, and we're going to define our terms. And when we talk about the problem of evil, in a kind of classical sense, it's fairly simple to write down, but it's not simple actually to see what's going on, and it's often incorrectly spelled out, okay? And it goes like this. God is all-powerful, right? God is all good. Right? Evil exists. Right? These are the 3 classical affirmations. 1, 2, 3. And the way that the problem of evil is stated very bluntly is all 3 of these can't be true at the same time and be coherent. Right? So that's the way that it's presented. It's stated that if God is all powerful and God is all good and evil exists, then either God actually isn't as powerful as we thought and something kind of got out of his hands, or he's actually not all good and so there's a defect, and since it's his creation, even though he is all powerful, he's not all good, and so the reason evil exists is because it's been allowed to exist because he's partly responsible for it. Okay, this is the way that it's articulated. In the history of thought, for those of you who are literature people, my mom was an English teacher. The finest articulation of this problem in terms of the way that it actually moves and has its being, and this is important, this is always a pastoral problem. Whenever I go in parishes and I present the gospel or I do an apologetic talk on college campuses, you don't get it articulated this way. What you get is this. My mom has cancer, right? Like that. My brother has been born with a birth defect since age 1. And it's very personal. It's always very personal. So The classic articulation is in a book called The Brothers Karamazov, which is written by Fyodor Dostoevsky, which is definitely, in my view, the finest novel of all time. And it comes through one of the three principal characters whose name is Ivan. And he presents the problem through the hardest example, I think, in terms of human terms, of the problem of evil. And that is, he presents it through the suffering of children. And for those of you who want to look this up, I'm sure I haven't checked the web, but there's a classic chapter in there called The Grand Inquisitor, where basically this sort of figure that Dostoevsky, through the character of Ivan, invents, puts Jesus on the stand and presents Jesus with history and basically says, you blew it. And the heart of his argument is, you have simple, innocent, basic children and they're suffering horribly. And so your problem is you don't realize that, as he says wonderfully in the argument, you have given them freedom and you don't realize they want bread. You've mismanaged the universe. Freedom is too great of an opportunity and too much of a risk. You don't realize what you've done. People don't want freedom. They want air, they want food, they want their needs met. And because of you, all these evil problems exist, especially innocent children suffering. You don't have to go any further than, for example, the overnight reports in Syria about the possible use of chemical weapons against children. Okay, so you imagine yourself with one of those families and one of those children and trying to say, okay, now I believe in an all-powerful, all-good God, and you have that in front of you. That's the kind of emotive power of the problem. Okay, now, I said to you that this is the simple way that it's defined. The problem is there's a subtlety that's gone into it, which is missed, and it's very important that we put it down. Actually, and I said this at convention, I want to make sure that you understand it, part of being an Anglican is to realize that the Holy Spirit has actually been working with the church for 20 centuries. You all know that, right? Actually 21 centuries now, right? We're actually in the 21st century. And we actually stand on the shoulders of people who've gone before us. And actually the problem of evil isn't new. So if you're going to take a subject like this seriously, you have to look at the best minds that we've ever produced who have had to wrestle with this. And by the way, all of them, Luther, Calvin, Barth, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, you take your pick. They all deal with this problem. They have no choice. And they've had a lot to say about it, okay? And if we do that, one of the great thinkers about this is Augustine. And what Augustine points out is, this way of stating the problem seems like it's coherent and seems like it's correct, but it's not, because it's missing a piece and it's actually misstated. And what Augustine says is, yes, okay, God is all powerful and God is all good, and what he did with that is he created, right? And what's left out of this apparent equation is any articulation of the nature of creation. And what Augustine formulates is the classic Christian response to the problem of evil. I'm sure probably all three of your previous speakers have spoken about this. I apologize, I haven't heard what they've had to say. But that is, part of creation is human beings. And human beings are created in the image of God, to live with God and for God forever. And God makes us in his image, which means we're like God. We think because God thinks. We choose because God chooses. We feel because God feels. But I just said something that's absolutely critical in terms of the way that Augustine sets this up. What you have to do is, when you articulate 1 and 2, you have to put 2a in here, or 3, and then make this 4. And you have to say, God is all powerful, God is all good. God creates a world and chooses. It's his choice. You can take it up with him later if you have problems, right? When you get to glory, right? That's the thing about these kind of problems is we don't have to give all the answers, actually. You and I are creatures. God is the creator. You're never going to get a complete answer to this, ever. No one that I've mentioned in terms of the great thinkers have ever given a comprehensive answer to this, okay? But what you have to understand is if God is all powerful and God is all good and he creates, what if the nature of creation involves facets that implicate the situation in terms of the way that the doctrine of evil is stated? And what Augustine comes up with is what's sometimes called, and those of you who are into initials, it's sometimes called the FWD, which is just a helpful way to remember it, and it's called the free will defense. And here's the simple way to state it. This is C.S. Lewis. For those of you do I have C.S. Lewis fans? I hope I have some. If you're stuck in my parish, you're going to get your sort of weekly, monthly C.S. Lewis quote. But he's another one who spent a lot of time thinking about these problems. What Lewis points out is, he says it this way in one of his writings. He says, mutual contradictions are mutual contradictions even for God. I just want you to stop and think about that for a second. What he's saying is 2 plus 2 equals 5 is not true, period. It's not true for Donnie, it's not true for Ian, it's not true for me, but it's also not true for God. And it doesn't matter whether you attribute it to God or not. Even God cannot accommodate himself to the law of non-contradiction. He's not that way. He doesn't contradict contradictions. He can't. He's logical and rational. Okay, so here's what Lewis says. Not even God can create a creature who is open and free to respond to him, who's not free to respond to him. Do you see what he's saying? You can't make a creation that involves the freedom to choose vis-a-vis the Creator and then say, aha, it's a problem. What if creation itself involves God's self-limitation? And what if God makes a creation which involves something as astounding as somebody who can freely choose not to follow God, who's made in God's image? Then you can't say to God, you're responsible for the consequences of the decision. He built the choice into it, but you can't hold him responsible directly. We can get to indirectly later for the choice. Okay? Do you see what Augustine is doing? It's very important that you understand the importance of placing. For some reason, this isn't quite staying on this ear, so I apologize. You have to put the importance of creation into the discussion in order to see it. Now, this is a profound observation that Augustine makes, and I want to unpack it, because this is often missed. When you deal with the problem of evil, what Augustine says, which is incredibly profound and directly relevant to our time tonight, is this. There are two things you need to realize about the problem of evil. The first is, what is the way that the Bible chooses to deal with it? Good question. If we're going to be under the Word of God, then we have to wrestle with everything in terms of the way it chooses to wrestle with it. And what is the Bible's portrayal of evil? Does it allow us to ask the question, why does evil exist? No. Actually, the Bible presents us with the fact of evil and says, oh no, which is exactly how we experience it. The origin of evil is never fully explained in the Bible. There are little hints of it, which we can go into if you want to later. Only hints, and they're never fully explained. This weird, slithering, deceiving character in Genesis 1 and 2 that's called Satan, where did he come from? He doesn't have a resume. He doesn't have a curriculum vitae. He just shows up. Where did he come from? We're not told. One thing to say right at the outset about the problem of evil is the fact of evil is the problem, not where it came from. You will never find a Christian theologian who fully resolves the origin of evil. It's not the origin of evil that the Christian tradition is interested in. It's the reality of evil in the world. One of the most important verses in the Old Testament is Deuteronomy 29:29, which states, and those of you taking notes, I want you to take it down. The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things that have been revealed belong to us and our children from generation to generation. Actually, there's things that we don't know. You know that, right? When I was taking theology, I studied with J.I. Packer, who's one of the 20th century giants in Anglican theology, and there was a great moment in class where one of the students asked him an extremely difficult question, which was this. Dr. Packer, here's a guy who spent all his life studying theology and all this stuff. Dr. Packer, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are in the fiery furnace in Daniel and other similar scenes, and there's that fourth figure in the furnace, is that a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus? This is a question. Are there appearances of Jesus in the Old Testament before the incarnation? That was the question. And we're all kind of like, because this is not your typical question, and it's not your typical person. And he said, I don't know. And there was like a full minute of total silence.
And he looked at us. I mean, it was like an E.F. Hutton commercial, or someone had been shot. And so he said, as he only he could do in his survey, he said, you know that it's okay to say that you don't know. It's actually quite important to say that you don't know. I haven't given it enough study. I don't know the answer. But there are things that it's okay not to know. Well, it was a real memory. Okay, so there's actually the origin of evil is something that none of us know and will ever know. Right? Even J.I. Packer, the house that Knowing God built, author person. I mean, even he can't answer all the questions, right? Okay, so we're presented with the reality of evil. Now, here's the thing that Augustine points out, in addition to the fact that evil's reality is what the Bible's interested in, not evil's origin. He points out that the entire problem with evil is built into creation. And this is important. When you deal with evil, what people don't do is they don't realize that it's built into the origin of things, the way the Christian tradition says that things have been set up. And here's what Augustine says. The deepest level of the problem of evil is the doctrine of hell, which we'll get to later. And what I want you to think about is the scene with Adam and Eve and what God says and how it actually unfolds and what's actually going on, because Augustine has a stunning insight that we need to start with tonight. And that is this. In the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. You remember this, right? They get this whole panoply of blessing and all this stuff, and it's all wonderful, except there's this one restriction, right? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Don't eat from that tree, right? And Satan comes and says, well, has God really said? And they enter into this debate, and you have the fall. But what Augustine points out is, when God says, in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die, it means die in three senses. Not two senses, three senses. First, you'll die spiritually. Second, you'll die physically. Those are the two that you usually get if you get a good sermon or somebody's doing a good Sunday school. Physical death and spiritual death, right? Physical death being the separation of the soul from the body, or some kind of similar language. Spiritual death being the separation of the soul from God, right? And what Augustine says is, oops, not deep enough, not full enough. There's more going on in Genesis than you realize. What God is actually saying is, if you do this, you will surely die means death in three senses. There are three kinds of death in the Bible: physical death, spiritual death, and the second death, or, using other New Testament language, eternal death. Eternal death is the separation of the soul and the body from God permanently. And here's Augustine's insight. The risk of hell is actually right there. Do you see what he's saying? If you create a being that has choice and some kind of capacity to respond to you and your God, then if they make the wrong choice, the choice has consequences for their relationship with God. And the final consequence of the wrong choice with God is separation of the soul and the body from God in hell. So actually, hell is a risk built into creation. So one of the many things that you're stuck with as we begin tonight that's important for you to understand is God built it into the nature of creation that there could be evil, and evil on an epic scale, in fact, even evil in relation to your relationship with God, which is the worst form of evil of all. And yet he made it. So again, that's something that you can take up with him less. If you think he blew it, you and I are living in creation, and so apparently he had some wisdom and thought it was worth it. But you can take that with him later. But you see what he's saying so far? Okay, now, that's the problem of evil, clearly stated. It doesn't have three parts, it's got four. God is all good, right? God is all powerful. Creation exists, then evil exists. That's the problem. Not the false articulation, the true articulation. All right, now, in the Christian tradition, how have people tried to solve it? Three answers. Okay? First of all, this is my little sort of theos, Greek letter, okay? You can try to solve the problem by driving the evil back into God's own character, okay? And this is the answer in the Christian tradition of the Reformed type when it gets messed up. Now, how many of you know the 39 articles? Since I am in a parish where Ian and Donnie are running around, I'm hoping that somebody knows something about the 39 articles. Has anybody heard of those? Okay, they're in the back in the small print, right? You remember? But if you actually look at Article 17, which is one of the articles, Article 17 is actually about predestination. And it actually says that you don't choose God, God chooses you, right? So actually the American Christian song, I Have Decided to Follow Jesus, is a spiritually messed up song in the worst way. And what you need to understand is when you walk through the door of I have decided to follow Jesus, I've decided to follow Jesus is on the door. When you look back, once you've gone through, what's on the front of the door is Jesus' statement in John's gospel, right? You did not decide to follow me. You did not choose me. I chose you. Right? Otherwise, you wouldn't choose God, because after the fall, you're not free to choose God. Okay? Right? So one of the things that predestination tries to deal with is the reality that after the fall, when we're saved, we need to have a sense of assurance and Christian hope. And what the doctrine of the predestination in Article 17 says is, predestination is actually, it uses this language, sweet, wonderful, encouraging doctrine. Because it talks about the work of Christ, and it focuses on Christ and the fact that Christ chose us, right? If you look at Calvin, for those of you who are Christian history people, there's 4 parts of the Book of Institutes, which are written in a very clearly structured way. And Calvin deals with predestination in the 3rd part, which is on the person and the work of Jesus. Okay? Now, stay with me, because this is where this solution goes. This solution takes Jesus, I'm going to write Christ instead of drawing an X, because I don't like X and Xmas very much. Okay, so Christ is a good place to deal with the reality of election and the issue of predestination. But there are theologians who are Calvinists that come after Calvin, Thomas Perkins especially comes to mind, who drive the problem back into the doctrine of God to solve the problem of evil. And here's the simple way to say it. God is in charge of everything. God makes the world. God says this group is going here. They're the damned. God says this group is here. They're going there. They're the elect. And so what you do is you take the reality of evil seriously, and you say God's will encompasses everything. God chooses people who are already damned before they're created. And the problem with that is, what you do then is, you mess up one of the poles on this, which is this pole. It's very hard, if you really become a hard Calvinist and drive the doctrine of evil back into God, so that God actually somehow makes evil, or nearly makes evil, or almost is related to evil, you end up with a God who is hardly able to be worshipped, which is a problem. But that's one way to do it. One thing you can say about that group, and you have to respect that, is they can deal with the problem of evil, right? Because God created the elect and God created the damned, and one went one way and one went the other way, and it was all there before creation, okay? That's a minority report. The second group, which is also a minority report, is, let's call this, there's so many ways to describe this. I think I'll call this the John Hick group. Okay, this group is interested in the fact that actually they say that Augustine's right and creation has evil built into it, but they say, but that's God's fault, because God took the risk and God made creation. So even though he's not directly responsible, he's indirectly responsible. And so what he said, what this group says is, it's very clear from human history, have you noticed, that evil exists and not everybody chooses God in this life. Have you noticed that? This is one of the problems of hell, is you have to deal with the fact that some people aren't saved. This has always bothered people in the Christian tradition. And you've got that risk in creation that I talked about. And so what this group does, instead of like this group driving it back into the doctrine of God, they do something else. They drive it further, they drive it into the future by using time. Now this is going to seem a little strange, but I promise I'm not making it up. This is a very serious theological viewpoint. What they say is, it's true that God created a world where there was a risk of creation, but instead of understanding that God wants to save people in history, what you have to realize is, says John Hick, God is trying to make souls. He's put people in a world where they're going to struggle, and all the people who don't meet God in this world, lucky for them, John Hick is their theologian, and he's figured out that God has lots and lots of time. And he basically expands the process of salvation almost infinitely. For those of you who are Fitz Allison fans, and you know Fitz well, he talks about the incredible problem of people not understanding that sin is by grace and works righteousness is one of his biggest bugaboos. Well, John Hick is a total nightmare, because what John Hick says is, if they're free to choose and they don't choose in this life, God has to keep working with them and keep trying. And this is serious, after eons and eons and universes, eventually God finally gets them as free people to freely choose Him. Okay, now what's good about this? What's good about this is it doesn't give up on God's goodness, and it does deal with the difficult problem of evil by stretching it out over time. But it has a huge opposite problem, which is the problem with these kind of problems is if you solve it one way, you run into it in another way, okay? And the other problem that they create is, what happens to a Christian doctrine of history? You ever thought about this? Actually, in the liturgy every week, I don't know if you write 2 up here, write 1, or what you use, but if I say, Christ has died, Christ is risen, can you finish it? Christ will come again. Okay, so here's the thing. Okay, as a Christian, if you have a Christian worldview, you actually believe that God creates, God redeems, and God glorifies, right? You believe in 3 tenses of creation. And part of a Christian understanding of history is, and you can take this up again with God if you don't like it, is God has made history and time. You know, time is something that's been created, right? God actually doesn't need time. Some theologians, many, think He lives beyond time. But you and I do, and history is the theater of God's salvific activity, and only history, right? So in Hebrews it says, it is appointed for man once to die, and after this the judgment, right? So when did God come to save the world? In history. When did God make the world? In history. When is God going to finally judge the world and finish the world? When the Son of Man returns, will He find faith on the earth? In history. God is a historical God who works in history. Guess what John Hick and company did? They solved the problem of evil at the level of the scale of the problem, because they didn't drive it back into God, they drove it forward into history. But what they did is they made history not matter. Think about it. Well, you didn't choose in this life for Jesus. That's okay. You got 12 more universes and 35 more existences to get it right. Do you understand what happens to that? First of all, it robs the incarnation. I mean, what does that actually mean? Christ has died. Christ is risen. Christ will come again. It is appointed for man once to die. Human beings don't live that way. That actually isn't the way that we think. That isn't the way that God has made the world. It completely robs history of its salvific significance. God is a God who works through the history that He's created. He made it, He's redeeming it, and He will come back and complete it. All of it in history. Right? This makes the really important stuff that God does. This is what drives me crazy about John Hick, is the really important stuff that God does is in what I call suprahistory. S-U-P-R-A. Right? It's like 20 centuries from now. Poor God. He needs all that time. And of course, the thing is, it would be nice, if that were true, the Bible doesn't look really very good, because it's very hard to read anywhere in the story where that's actually the way that He'd set it up. And that's actually a foundational structural point of His whole theology. So you would think, in a Christian system which involves revelation and God giving us the story, if this is the way that it's set up, you would think that it's in there. In fact, not only is it not in there, it's actually, what's in there actually contradicts it, all right? Now, what I want you to understand before I finish up on the majority report and sort of where I am is to understand that these 2 false answers, and this is true a lot of times in Christian thinking, is when you get bad ideas, if the people who give them to you are good, they're good bad ideas. You do know this, right? Good churches produce good heretics. Did you know that? It's one of the reasons why you know the Episcopal Church is so bad. The Episcopal Church is so bad because our heretics are not interesting. They're terrible. They're so boring. They're so dull, right? I mean, if you actually look at the history of Christian theology, When the early church takes off in the first 400 centuries, and you get somebody like Montanus or somebody like Arius or something, they're really smart. They're really close to the truth. They get most of it really right. And here's the problem is, really bad theology is like an archery arrow that just misses its target, and then it goes out, and the problem is it never stops into eternity. But it actually just misses, right? So we're not talking about people that can't even tell you where the target is and they're shooting in the wrong direction or something. We're talking about people who almost hit the target. And what I want you to understand about these two sets of groups, and there are lots of people we can put them in, they're doing something important. Each of these groups is taking God seriously, and they're taking the problem seriously. And a lot of people who deal with this issue don't do that. And so it's one thing to say, well, I don't think this is right. But if you don't think that's right, you still have to respect what they're doing. This one takes God, I think, more seriously. And you have to say this one takes evil more seriously. What we want to do is take both seriously. Okay, so how am I doing? Okay, I'm okay. We're going to get to the majority report, and then we're going to take questions. Okay, so we're going to call this the Augustine group with the Harmon modification.
That's good cut.
Well, just to put a title on it. Okay, so here's the thing. Okay, so what I want to argue is we can't solve it by driving all of it back into God and making God somehow involved with evil, because then we won't be able to worship. We can't solve it by going forward in time and somehow robbing history of its significance. Okay? So we have to take God seriously, evil seriously, and the doctrine of history seriously. And the Christian tradition has actually figured out a way to do this. It's just a lot of people have missed the level of insight. Okay, so here's the first thing. Think about what Augustine said. Augustine said God created creation, and he actually built the risk of spiritual death, right, physical death, but actually eternal death into the equation at the beginning. Okay? Now, this is very, very important. Like almost everything in Christian theology, the way that you really, really get it into focus is the cross. And since we're not too far from Good Friday, this is a good subject for a Lenten talk. But a lot of things change when you look at them from the perspective of the cross. And I hope that you're used to doing this. This is a very important Christian exercise. Sometimes I say to my own congregation, that's one of the best places to start in the morning. Right? Nothing in my hands I bring, only to thy cross I cling. Right? You just start that way. You actually didn't make this day. You didn't make yourself. You didn't make this parish. Right? It puts you in a position where you're a creature, but it also puts you in a position where you start to operate in terms of gratitude. It's a very revolutionary thing. Look at how often Paul says, I glory in the cross of Christ. He says in 1 Corinthians 2:2, for I know nothing among you but Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Okay, now here's the thing. Most people don't think of the cross in terms of this problem sufficiently. And here's the crucial thing that Augustine helps us with if we take it all the way to the cross. What you have to understand is God actually did build it into creation. It's all there. All forms of death. Physical death, spiritual death, and eternal death. They're all there. And here's the power of Good Friday is the God who created creation with the risk of it isn't responsible for it, but He put the risk in. What He does on the cross, in part, and it isn't often thought about this way, is He takes all the consequences of the risk on Himself. So actually, evil is dealt with in history on the cross. And this is critical. You cannot think of my topic, final arrangements, eschatology, the end of history, as this innocent chapter at the end of the story. Because that's not the way that God works. In Jesus Christ, God actually wrote the story, and He entered the story as one of the characters in His own story. So think about this. In Jesus Christ, eternity has intersected with time. In Jesus Christ, the judge has come already and judged Himself in your place and my place. Why is that important? Well, we have the final form of the problem of evil, which is hell. Now I'm going to finish with this. It's a very, very loaded subject, but if you actually think about it from a New Testament perspective, it's got three facets to it. If you look at all the passages, and by the way, The people in the New Testament who talk the most about hell are Jesus and Paul. It's mostly Jesus. And oh, by the way, when Jesus talks about hell, he doesn't talk about hell in the context of unbelievers. What's fascinating is he talks about it in a context like this, right? You all are here presumably because you're walking with the Lord and you want encouragement in your faith. This is the kind of context in which Jesus is talking about hell with the disciples. So the caricature of the Christian preacher talking about the end of the world to people who don't know Jesus is taking the use of hell in the New Testament Christian tradition right out of where it's intended. Okay, so what does hell mean? Well, there's three images. One is destruction, right? One is punishment and similar language. And the other, and you have to have all three, is personal exclusion. I don't know if you've ever thought about all three of them, but they're all there. Paul says their end is destruction. In Matthew 25, you remember the parable of the sheep and the goats? Right? You will go to the right hand or to the left. And to the right hand, he said, enter into the joy of your master. Right? And then on the left hand, the goats say, depart from me, for you will go into, and the language is eternal punishment. Right? So this kind of language. Now, where does this come from? Well, lots of passages that nobody preaches on with a 25-foot pole, but they're actually in there, sorry. For example, Romans 9. Remember Romans 9 where Paul says to the Jewish people, he says, I myself would be cut off from Christ if it would be what was necessary so that you could come to know Christ. That's an incredible statement on Paul's part. Why? Because Paul's life was changed on the Damascus Road when he was in the middle of noonday prayer as a good God-fearing Jew, because he prayed several times a day. And instead of worshiping God, guess who showed up in the middle of his prayers? God in the person of Jesus Christ, shining in Jesus' face. As he will later say, the God who said, let light shine in darkness, will shine in the face of our Lord Jesus Christ with his glory. That whole experience Paul had was his experience on the Damascus Road. Instead of meeting the invisible God, and that's what's all the way through the Old Testament, I am the invisible God, he says in Colossians, he says, he is the invisible God. Where did he get the idea that the face of Jesus is the invisible God? Because when he was having noonday prayer and the eyes of his heart were open, even though his physical eyes were closed, he looked, and instead of seeing unapproachable light, which is what he thought through the whole Old Covenant tradition he grew up in, instead of seeing the God who dwells in unapproachable light, he saw a face, and the face was Christ. Why do I say all that? Because for Paul, to be saved is to meet Jesus face to face. What does he say in 1 Corinthians 13? Now we see in a mirror dimly, then we shall see face to face. Where did he get the idea of face to face? Right there in the Damascus Road. Why do I say all that? Because when he says to be cut off from Christ, that means a lot more to Paul than to most of us, because he had the most dramatic experience of his whole life looking into the face of Jesus. And what he's saying is, to see that face and then be cut off from it is the greatest loss that you can ever have. You see what he's saying? Okay, so how about this from Luke 13? You remember this? Jesus uses this kind of language. Depart from me, I never knew you. Oops. Now, why do I say all this? Because this is the most powerful way, it seems to me, to think about Good Friday. What do you see on Good Friday? You see a person who is destroyed. Right? He was despised. A man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Isaiah 53, the way that Jesus is described, he's hardly even recognizable as a human being. Right? So that when you cease to follow God as a human being who's intended to follow God, what happens to you is you lose contact with reality and the created order, and you dissolve. So what you see is barely something. Barely a human being. He's being destroyed. Right? He's barely there. He's withering away. Punishment, we don't need to spend too much time going. I mean, the judgment that's upon him, one of the thieves says, we deserve this punishment. Right? But he's innocent. So he suffers the punishment, all the punishment, the worst form of punishment imaginable, the crucifixion. But don't miss this one, right? We're doing a series where I am on the 7 last words of Jesus, and I had the 4th word last Sunday, which is, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Don't miss that. What does that represent? It represents exclusion or abandonment, personal exclusion, conscious personal exclusion, but it represents something which gets us to the heart of the closest answer you can give to the problem of evil, and that's this. It's not just exclusion, it's not just personal exclusion, it's not just conscious personal exclusion, as horrendous as all three of those are. There's another dimension, and that is on the cross, Jesus suffers something that you and I never can and never will. And that's because he's the second person of the Trinity. And it's a really horrible thing for a human being to lose God. But at one point, Luther is purported to have said about this fourth word, God forsaking God, who can understand it? And here's the closest you can get, I think, on this side of glory to the answer to the problem of evil. God did create the risk inherently the way it was all set up. Augustine's right. All of those dimensions of death are there. But God took all of those dimensions and more onto himself. So the risk that God took, he took the consequences and more. And here's the thing about what that says about evil is, you don't solve evil by logical explanation. God is doing something very profound on the cross, and that's why it's so important to focus our thoughts on the cross. The only way to really solve, and that's in quotes, the problem of evil, is not to treat it as a rational problem, but to treat it as a historical reality and to take the suffering in Jesus' name upon yourself. To a small extent. But to let Jesus doesn't deal with the problem of evil by rationally explaining it. He deals with the problem of evil by conquering it in himself in history. And that's not only profound in terms of the risk of creation, it's profound in another sense, and that is it tells us how God deals with evil, which is not to rationally explain it, but to deal with its historical reality by dealing with its consequences. Which means that somebody like Mother Teresa, to pick one of hundreds of examples, is actually pointing us in directions. There's a lot of elements of Christians dealing with those who are suffering that are very profound. But one of the aspects is it actually points to the God who takes all the consequences on himself. All right, well, there's a few thoughts to get your juices going. Comments and questions from you. You see the difference between the majority report and the minority report? I'm not going to... You have to solve it in time.
Just in terms of theodicy,
Yeah.
the two minority reports are greater good theodicy. Are you presenting Augustine as a created order theodicy then?
A created order theodicy? Yeah. Yeah, definitely. The thing that you could get on this one about is then you have another problem, which is kind of it's a sub-dimension, but I want to make sure you're aware of it, because every time you try to solve this problem, you create other problems. If I do this, then I have another problem, which is, what about the people who don't respond to God in time, listen carefully, who'd never had the knowledge so that they had the capacity to knowledgeably respond to God, or at least consciously. In other words, the problem of those who've never heard becomes very big when you're dealing with this, right? You don't have to deal with that over here because God created them, so it doesn't matter, because they get the opportunity that God wants. And over here you don't have to deal with it, because if you don't have a conscious opportunity in this life to deal with God, that's okay, because you get it 25 centuries later in 32 different worlds or something. But this one you do, because I'm saying God only works in history. So that means you have a problem, which is, if God is good, how can God hold people responsibly for consciously responding to him if they don't have knowledge of exactly who he is?
What's the answer to that?
I was hoping I could just ask the question. Do you want me to answer it? Well, I think this is another thing that people don't talk about. I don't think that this is a very good solution, right? This way of saying is, well, God made people and they only get a certain amount of knowledge because that's what God gives them, and God's in charge of everything, so tough. The difficulty with that is, if you really are in an aboriginal culture, right, a missionary culture where you're what the missiologists call an unreached people group, right? If you actually never heard of Jesus, how can you be responsible for responding to someone whose name you never even heard, much less understood? And it seems to me that part of the answer to that is in Romans 2, where Paul says that there's a distinction between Jews and Gentiles, and that part of the way that what God works in terms of judgment is judgment involves accountability for the knowledge that you have. So you all actually have created a problem for yourself by coming to this class, because you're now actually more accountable than you used to be, because you might have actually learned something. And with greater knowledge comes greater responsibility. I don't know if you know that. Coming to Christian classes is dangerous as well as encouraging. Okay, but here's the point is, I don't think that God holds somebody for consciously responding to him if they didn't have the conscious opportunity to know him. So then what do I say? What Paul says in Romans 2 is, their conscience will tell them, and on that day their conscience will accuse them or perhaps excuse them, he says. And here's the idea. The idea is God holds you accountable for the knowledge that you have. So if you didn't have the capacity to know Jesus, you are not saved through the knowledge of Jesus that you couldn't have. But what happens is, in God's grace and his mercy, there are people who have a very fledgling and inadequate sense of God's mercy who are nevertheless saved. And here's the key point. No one is saved without being saved through Christ. Two quick examples. One is, if you're for C.S. Lewis fans, 7th book, Last Battle, Calormean Soldier. Anybody remember this character? He's actually in there. He's a disaster. His theology is terrible. In fact, he's following Tash, who's the false Aslan. Disaster. He gets saved. Wrong church, wrong theology. Saved. Why? Because his heart's in the right place and he actually isn't responsible for the lousy theology that he's been given, because it's all he knows and it's all he believes. So you actually have this non-Christian who's somehow saved. And that's always been there in the Christian tradition. The other story, which is probably even better, is in a Don Richardson book, when he's describing a missionary story that he bumps into in the field, where a guy goes into this village, tells the story of the gospel, and only one person responds, but he responds completely. And he's stunned by this, and the missionary said, "How did you..." And he says to the missionary afterwards, after he's baptized, he says, "All my life I've always believed something like this. But when you said what you said, I realized that was where I was going, and that was what I wanted to be true. I believed in that kind of mercy. I just didn't know where to find it." So I don't think it's conscious, but I think it's true of everybody, and I think God is fair. So I preserve God's goodness, but I deal with the mess of history. It's far from perfect, but at least deals with the evidence at hand. That's my answer.
As for second pastoral care, can you differentiate that from Carl Reiner's Anonymous Christian?
Sure. The question is about Carl Reiner's Anonymous Christian for the purpose of pastoral care. Yeah, the difficulty with Reiner is, Reiner's idea of the Anonymous Christian, especially the way it gets seized upon in kind of mainline Christianity, is the worst form of what's going on in the last battle, which is, Ashland is Tash, get it? So you get Tashland. So basically, where people are in their hearts, it doesn't matter what they say they believe, they're somewhere else already. So you get somebody who's a fill-in-the-blank, dyed-in-the-wool Buddhist, atheist, or something like that, and somehow, if they do moral things or something, God somehow treats them as if they were anonymously part of his flock, even though they aren't consciously there. The problem with that is, it's not looking for mercy, it's actually a form of works righteousness. And it robs the cross of its salvific power. So I don't like it. I also think it doesn't deal with the mess of the difference between Christian differences with other religions that you have to deal with. Real dialogue has to acknowledge real differences and not gloss over them and shove everybody into a phone booth and say, deposit your controversial differences here, just get in the booth, which is what a lot of interfaith Right. Yeah, it's very prevalent. Other comments or questions from you in terms of what I said, or your own questions about? Yes, sir. Yes.
Does this not overly complicate theology? All this, it should be the simplest thing, the most simple, understanding person can understand.
Yeah.
It seems to me that all this Christianity is an expression of love. you already demonstrate your relationship with God, which comes from the heart.
Right.
You can't be taught, you can't, I don't think that a person could say, well, I'm going to be fitted to this, and do nothing else about it except believe very strongly that, what you indicated is. But it seems to me to be somewhat overly emphasizing the all these pluses and minuses and interconnected things that most people are incapable of understanding.
Well, it's describing them that way, but it's actually not talking about that at the level of people's own experience. That's why I like the Don Richardson story. I mean, the whole point of that story is that guy is a Christian. He would be the closest to what Ronner should mean by anonymous Christian if there were such a thing. And whether the missionary came to him and told him the fullness of the truth, or whether he only had the partial insight that he got from creation and his own conscience, he was trying to respond to the mercy and to the revelation that he had. And that's a simple thing. The explanation for why it makes sense is more complicated. That I concede. But no, it is simple. It's about God can't make free beings who are not free not to respond to him. God can't make 2 + 2 be 5, even if he's God.
I think in the 4th grade in school up at Clemson, we had to memorize a book and atom is driving crease. And it was really an interesting poem. A book and atom was, I can't remember who wrote it now, but it's an interesting poem to read. It goes something like, a book and atom is driving crease of what one night from a deep dream of peace saw in the moonlight in his room an angel writing in a book of gold. Seeking peace made Ben out of bold. Well, he went and asked the figure, and what are you doing? He says, I'm writing in the book of those who love the Lord, in the name of those who love the Lord. And the book said, is mine in that? And he said, no. And the book went away, and he came back the next night, and the angel was there again, and he asked him if his name was there, and he said, and no, Ben Adams' name led all the rest, because he asked if he be written in there as one who loves his fellow man.
Right.
And it just kind of pointed out the fact that you demonstrate, I think, your love and relationship with God by loving your fellow man and doing things that God would otherwise can't do, because he's working through you.
Right, he chooses to work through you. But that's why the first and great commandment and the second is like unto it are so helpful in the prayer book. It is very simple in a way, but also the simple is the profound. Loving God and loving your neighbor